So thank you for the introduction, Megan, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today to speak about something that I'm quite passionate about and interested in. As Megan said, the focus of today's meeting is on adaptive silviculture to climate change. And Courtney is going to be speaking after me in terms of more the focus on silviculture itself, but the point of this talk is to provide some context on climate change, the type of climate change to be expected here in the Maritimes, the Acadian forest, and how that's currently expected to affect our forest, and which connects with silviculture. So I'd like to begin with a bit about how much climate change we could expect, the impact on the Acadian forest as we know it today, knowledge gaps, and then go into what we can do about it, which may include silvicultural options. Well, I'd like to start with this slide in my talks, and there's a lot of local people here who have probably seen a few of my talks before, and I start with this slide, but this is the mean annual temperature of the world over the past 130 years, for which we have good actual measurements of temperature. And so what you're seeing here is not make-believe. These are real compiled data. This particular source is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association in the United States. And this is showing mean annual temperature from the 1880s all the way up to the present, including the year 2018, that last point on there. And I'm going to use my mouse a lot today to point to things. 2016 being the warmest point on record. And since the 1950s, it's pretty clear that the change in temperature of the world over time. So make no mistake about it, the planet is currently warming. And what's driving this change in temperature? Well, it's primarily the greenhouse gases, specifically our emissions of carbon dioxide. This is an interesting graphic from NASA, and it shows the estimated atmospheric concentration of CO2 over the past 650,000 years, largely derived from ice core samples. And then we could see where our current composition is right here on this point here. We're currently sitting around 410 parts per million. And so we're at, currently, the concentration of CO2 is higher than any point over the past 650 years, according to our best proxy records. So it's significant, the amount of CO2 we currently have in our atmosphere. This is a little shorter time scale to demonstrate our impact, but this is CO2 concentration measurements from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and the kneeling curve, or summarized kneeling curve, from 1960 up until the present date. And so you can see over the past 60 years the change in atmospheric CO2 concentration in our atmosphere. CO2 is going up, and it hasn't slowed down any. I remember when I first started looking at this stuff myself in the early 2000s, and all the efforts and talk about what can we do? Are we going to be able to significantly reduce our emissions? But it hasn't changed a whole lot over that period of time. Well, it hasn't decreased, I should say. So that's a little bit about global context in terms of climate. What about locally here in the Acadia forest? So this is this graphic here is showing the historic and then projected change in mean annual temperature for the Acadian forest. The black line here is showing change, historic temperature, summarized per decade over the last, from roughly 1850 up until the present. The little orange dot is the 5-year average in the Acadian forest of mean annual temperature, sitting around 5.9 degrees. The red line is the RCP 8.5, which is commonly known as the business as usual climate change scenario, which is the trajectory we're on right now. And then the blue line is the more optimistic projection if humanity could really get itself together and adhere to the Paris climate agreements, is what the projected future climate would be, temperature that is. So you can see the significant growth of projected temperature for this region, an 8-degree change above the 20th century average to roughly about a mean annual temperature of 12 degrees by the end of this century. And even with the best case scenario, which is now unlikely, we're still looking at an increase of roughly about 3.5 degrees above the 20th century average this century. So potential big changes in temperature ahead. And to put that into context for you, by towards the end of the century, that's like taking the climate of Virginia right now and us becoming that climate within the next 75 years. And this is like, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist. I mean, I try to use climate science to do my work in forest ecology. But these are some of the best climate scientists in the world, and these are their projections for what's going to happen here. So it's something to take serious. Anyway, so that's some context in terms of the kind of climate change we can expect for our region. So what does that mean for our forest here in the Maritimes? And that's the main focus of this workshop here today. And so this is not actually a very easy question to tackle. It's a very multifaceted question. How will climate change affect our forest? One way I like to discern it is to think about the direct effects of climate on our trees and then the indirect effect of climate on our trees. And this graphic is supposed to sort of help relay that information. So the climate itself, climate directly affects the performance of trees, their growth, reproduction, survival, by affecting things like rates of photosynthesis and respiration, phenology, the timing of bud burst and leaf out, for instance. Climate directly affects the amount of moisture that's in the soil available to trees for growth. So these represent direct effects of climate on the performance of the trees that we utilize. But the climate also affects a lot of other things within the ecosystem as well that indirectly affect the trees. For instance, the climate is unlikely to affect all tree species the same way, which changes the interactions between tree species, or plant species that is. The climate also affects things like forest insects and diseases in the forest. So changes in those can also change the trees that we depend on. And climate affects other things like other abiotic disturbances like fire and wind in the forest. So when thinking about how climate change affects the forest, we also have to consider these other aspects of the forest ecosystem and how they affect the trees. And to make things really complicated, these things affect the trees, but then the trees also affect these things again too. So there's lots of like interacting loops within a forest ecosystem. I like to say it's not rocket science, it's more complicated than that. Well, I didn't make that up. I like to say it. Anyways, so what I wanted to do next was just to talk a little bit about some of the direct effects of climate on trees and then some of the indirect effects. So let's begin with the direct effect of climate on trees. So this is a map showing the major vegetation zones of the planet. And it's been known for some time. It's been known for quite a long time. I mean, like a couple centuries, how climate has a strong control over the distribution of plant species on the planet. And this is quite evident when you look at a map like this and you see the bands of various types of vegetation. If you focus in on this area up here, where we are, you could see, well, the way they have it in this map anyways, a band of where the real boreal forest separates from the boreal mixedwood temperate forest right here. And there's one scientist in particular, Ian Woodward, I think I'm saying his name correctly, who did a lot of work in the 80s and early 90s, and he published a really famous book in the late 80s, who focused specifically on trying to understand the effect of climate on plant distribution. And from his work then and from papers now, it's well known that what forms these bands largely is cold tolerance and the effect of moisture availability on vegetation. So why is this? Well, why climate has an effect on plant species has something to do with something called environmental niche theory. No species can be adapted to all environments. Just like people, no person can be good at everything. You have specialists like brain surgeons who are really good at that, but then probably couldn't fix a bicycle kind of thing. Or then you have jacks of all trades who are more generalists. And when it comes to understanding organisms in our environment, it's the same sort of thing. Species tend to be either specialists, evolved to certain environments, or some tend to be generalists, so they're good at a lot of things, but not that good. And the same goes when it comes to trying to understand a species' ability to survive at different climates. We have some species that are evolved to survive in the cold really well, such as our boreal cold-adapted species, but that comes at a cost. When you evolve to become adapted to the cold or northern regions, you give up some things that make you less competitive under warmer conditions. And this is an important concept to keep in mind, I think, when thinking about silviculture and how silviculture could be applied to deal with climate change, or when just trying to understand how species respond to climate change. this little graphic that I put here together is meant to sort of represent this. Each species has a specific climate niche, and with multiple factors affecting how that species is adapted to certain environments. And here is just a three-dimensional graph I put together showing 3 climate variables. And each species, for instance, would have an area within that three-dimensional space where it's adapted to perform the best species performance. Using this type of reasoning and information, there are some scientists who put together climate envelope or climate niche models. And basically what a climate niche model is we look at like where that species occurs on the landscape right now, where is it at, and then we look at, well, the climate of where it's at, and then we correlate the two things. And we can develop a climate envelope out of that. This particular graph right here, the one on the left, or your right, I guess, is showing that the climate envelope for balsam fir. So the green area, well, all the colored areas are showing the climate that's most suited to balsam fir in North America. Not necessarily where balsam fir is, but where the climate is most suited to where balsam fir is. The one on your left is showing where that climate space will be towards the end of the century under that RCP 8.5 one. So you can see how by the end of the century, if we continue with business as usual climate change, the climate that we think is most associated with growing good balsam fir has shifted north quite a bit. That's not to say that balsam fir are all going to move. We will probably still have our balsam fir here, but the optimum environment to grow those balsam fir, at least climate-wise, is not going to be there. This is the same sort of figure for red oak. The current climate envelope for red oak right here, and where it's projected to be by the end of the century under RCP 8.5. Does anybody have any questions about that so far?
You have drill work, but do you have, is it the same for fir as it is for spruce?
I don't have it here. I actually do have it in this computer. I can show it to you after. But it's a similar trend. Like for red spruce, for instance, on the map of North America, there's a defined climate space that's currently the best space for that. And then we can project where that climate space will be into the future. And it looks similar to the fir situation.
You mentioned that, I mean, obviously the trees are not going to get up, uproot themselves and move just the climatic characteristics of the region inhospitable or less hospitable. What does that translate as? Reduced germination potential or increased susceptibility to like freeze-thaw cycles or all kinds of things?
Yes, it could be a lot of those things and different ones for different species. And one term I like to use just to sort of sum it up is the species performance, which includes like its ability to grow, survive, and reproduce. And each species, of course, has evolved differently for specific different climate conditions. And as the conditions change, like just as this example is fir, as the climate most suited to fir, at least according to this model, shifts, well then the fir that are here, they're now maladapted. They're not so well adapted anymore. And for each species, I guess it's different in terms of how that was specifically affected.
I'm not familiar with your research, but I am familiar with the research of Dr. Charles Borg. And I'm wondering if you can explain, does your research, and do they confirm each other, or do they have wildly different results? Are you familiar with this work?
I am indeed, yeah. No, I would say for the most part, both pieces of work are in line with one another.
Okay.
Well, yeah, and there's reasons for that I want to get into at the end of this talk, which actually highlight where there needs to be improvement in science. And so, but we'll get to that soon. So that little spiel was just to talk about the direct effect of climate on trees themselves. But let's just focus a little bit on the indirect effect of climate change on the trees. So as the climate changes, it's going to affect some of the natural disturbances that we experience here in the Maritimes. This is a non-native species called Hemlock Woolly Adelgid that a lot of you probably heard about in the media and whatnot, and it's now in southern Nova Scotia. And this is a species that was introduced here in the 1950s, and it's made its way up the eastern seaboard over the past 50 years. And one of the things that about this species, at least what the entomologists tell me, is that wintertime temperatures actually do keep this thing to the south constrained. And specifically, if you look at this top map here, this is showing isotherms of mean annual temperature currently. And especially average wintertime temperatures of -5 seem to be where the insect that stays. Below that isn't like colder than that at wintertime and interferes with its life cycle. And so if you look at this map here, this is where the insect is currently moved to, is southern Maine and into southern Nova Scotia, which share a similar mean wintertime climate. If you look at this map down here, this is showing the mean wintertime temperature by the end of the century under RCP 8.5. And you can see how that -5 isotherm, where it's like to go beyond, has now shifted quite a bit. And so now the insect has free reign over much of New Brunswick as well. So it's just an example of how, as the climate shifts, it could affect other things within the ecosystem. Another example is wildfire. We don't commonly associate wildfire with the Maritimes, at least not now, because of our more wet climate here. But it is something to consider into the future as the climate warms. And this map here is showing homogeneous fire zones in Canada, and the more red, the more area burnt per year by fire. And this is some work from a colleague at the CFS, and this map on your left is showing, on your right rather, is showing fire zones currently, and this map here is showing how the fire zones will change towards the end of the century under RCP 8.5 again. And so if you look down at the Maritimes here, it's relatively light colored, which means we don't get a lot of annual burning from fire. But by the end of the century, according to this study, we could see a potential increase in the amount of area burned by fire. So another aspect to think about. So there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and that's the point I'm trying to hit home here. And so we have tools at our disposal to help integrate this information and try to make a projection about how the forest will change. And that's where ecosystem modeling comes into play. And this is where a lot of my own work focuses. And what I like about ecosystem modeling is it gives us an opportunity to provide a framework to take these various pieces of empirical information that scientists have been working on and integrate them together into a virtual forest ecosystem, and then run that system over time under various stimuli, whether it be changes in climate. And that's what this graphic here is meant to represent. Taking an actual piece of forest real estate and representing it within a computer program and trying to incorporate all our best biology and ecology with how that system works, and then use that information to make projections into the future. So this is a piece of work that we did a few years ago, something similar, something like this. And we specifically focused on the Acadian forest. So what we did in this piece of work here is we picked 1,000 different points across the Maritimes, across the Acadian forest, plots, and at each point we simulated a 1 hectare forest. And we simulated it until the end of the 21st century, and we did it under different climate change scenarios. And then we looked at how the model predicted the change in climate would affect changes in species composition and species growth. And what we found, according to this study, was in the short term, the model we were working with wasn't able to detect any significant changes up until the year roughly 2050. But once you get past the year 2050, under the RCP 2.6, the best case scenario, we didn't detect any significant changes from today's forest. But under RCP 8.5, the business as usual scenario, the model began to detect significant changes in structure and function over time. Specifically, changes in a decline in the abundance of cold adapted tree species, arboreal species, increases in warm adapted temperate species, and something that we're referring to as a deborealization of the Acadian forest. Just to graphically represent that, this pie chart is showing the composition of all those plots currently. And as you can see, there's a big chunk of the pie is balsam fir and spruce. And I compare this graphic with other estimates of the current composition of the Acadian forest. And roughly, the Acadian forest does comprise roughly about 50% fir and spruces. So there's a lot of fir and spruce here. This is what the model projected the forest would become by the end of the century under that RCP 8.5 climate change scenario. And so this model really loves red maple. It's saying it's really going to increase. But the main point of this exercise in this graphic here is that it's showing a reduction in cold adapted species, specifically fir and spruce, and an increase in warm adapted species, specifically in this case red maple. And I think it has largely to do with the fact that red maple is such a generalist species, hence why the model liked it so much. In terms of forest growth estimates for the Acadian forest, this gray bar that you see here is an error envelope. So anything within that 10% envelope we just ignore. But any kind of signal outside of that is significant according to the model. And so in the short term, which is the year 2050, the model is projecting a potential decrease in the productivity of our forest. But by the end of the century, under RCP 8.5, a significant decrease in the growth of our forest.
Is that based on the current like 50% spruce fir, or is that accounting for the peppered species that are going to fill in that gap?
Yeah, it's accounting for all the species that are here, and it's accounting for the potential change in species composition as well, an increase in the warm adapted species and decrease in the cold adapted species. And this also, I should say that this graphic here it's comparing current growth rates with projected future growth rates. So an 18% decrease compared to current growth rates in the short term, and a 40% decrease in growth rates in the long term. So anytime you're doing this kind of work, that you want to try to understand, well, why is the model saying this? So in terms of the compositional shifts that the model is projecting, what's driving this in the model that we're working with is mainly interspecific competition, changes in the relative competitive rates of tree species. Some species are becoming more competitive, and other ones are becoming less competitive, and that's driving changes in composition. And this point specifically has implications, I think, for silvicultural research, because oftentimes when we're doing silviculture, it's to help control for competition or use competition elements to our advantage. And so that may be something to consider. The change in growth that the model is projecting is largely due to the direct effect of climate on some of the tree species. Some of the tree species in there are being penalized because it's getting warmer. And the other thing that's driving this large reduction in growth that the model is predicting is this blocking mechanism within the model, which kind of sets up a neat hypothesis to test for real. But it's the fact that so much of our forest right now is already occupied by spruce and fir, and the kind of rapid climate changes that we're projecting, they're going to happen really quick over the next 50 years. And so it's not like the spruce and fir can get out of the way for the better adapted, warm adapted species. And so even though like the deciduous maples and oaks, they're here and they might do better under this warmer climate, there's just not enough of them to make up for the potential loss of the cold adapted species. And also, I like to hit home from this work that we're not suggesting that balsam fir and spruce will disappear from the landscape, but they may become increasingly maladapted to the climate that's going to become our region. So how do our results from this particular study align with other modeling studies out there? So here's just a small list I put together of 3 other studies, Charles Bork's study at UNV being one of them, another study out of the US, and another colleague in CFS, both doing similar type of modeling work, but completely independent, and also with different ways, different types of models, and all of them coming up, though, with similar types of outcomes in terms of declines in the cold adapted boreal species and increases in some of the warm adapted species. This specific figure on the left, right here, is a piece from Megan's report, which probably will be something that you guys use today, maybe in your workshop. But it's comparing a piece of work that the Fundy Biosphere Reserve did on this column right here, our work, Taylor et al., and then Bork's work, and it's comparing whether each study predicted an increase or decrease in each tree species. It's quite a list of tree species here. And it's interesting to see how the results compare. And for the most part, I'd say there's a lot of agreements, specifically on these ones that I'm highlighted here in red, like balsam fir, red maple, an increase in red maple, and a decrease in white spruce. So that's comparing it with modeling studies. But what about other actual empirical studies? Studies on the ground now that are trying to measure, can we see changes in tree species composition already? And there are studies slowly being published now that are beginning to detect some of the changes that these models are predicting. And the one I want to highlight here is a high impact paper published 2 years ago by Fay et al. Out of Purdue University and the journal Science. And this graphic's a little bit complicated, but I'd like you to take a few minutes to try to understand it. So this figure here, where my mouse is showing the actual change in temperature over the past 30 years in the U.S., in the eastern U.S., with the blue area showing actually cooling and the red area showing a warming. And this figure here is showing the change in precipitation over the past 30 years, where the purple bluish colors are places that are getting wetter, and the more umpire colorblind, the brown green areas are getting drier. So this is the actual changes in climate taking place within eastern U.S. over the last 30 years. And what they did is they went and they looked at all the permanent sample plots that are across eastern U.S., and there's thousands of them, and they looked at how the changes, how the abundance of tree species, in terms of saplings and galls, how they've changed over that 30-year period. And they have these neat little rose diagrams down here. I'm just going to focus on this one right here. And the way these rose diagrams work is it's like a compass with north pointing up, south pointing down, east, west here. And each piece of the pie is showing, if the pie is bigger, then more species are changing, shifting their abundance in that direction. So if you look here, there's a big shift in the pie here. This piece of the pie is really big. It's because the data is actually showing a shift in species abundance towards the northwest. And this is for all stems. This is just focusing on saplings here, where we're seeing what they found in this paper was a general shift northward and westward of species composition. And I tried to write down the main points right here. One thing that was interesting was they found that 71% of the gymnosperms, the conifers, are shifting northwards, which is kind of what we'd expect according to some of the modeling studies. So anyways, this is a high-level piece of work that's showing that there is actually some change that's taking place that seems to be correlated with changes in climate. However, anytime someone presents you with these kind of modeling results, you should take it with a grain of salt and think critically about what people are suggesting to you. So I want to go back to our environmental niche theory that we talked about earlier. So anytime we're doing this kind of work, the idea is to better understand this niche. How does each species respond to changes in these various environmental factors, such as like changes in mean summertime temperature or minimum winter temperature. Each species has evolved to a different combination of these things. And I would argue that right now, actually, our knowledge of maximum summertime temperature is still quite weak. I think that science has better understanding of the cold limits of tree species performance, whether it be growth or reproduction. But in terms of species limits, in terms of warming, I'd say our knowledge is much weaker. And when we do these models, whether it be Bork's work, my own work, or others, a lot of them are currently based on that climate envelope stuff that I talked about. And the climate envelope stuff is very correlated. And the warm limits that are associated with that we use in our models are where we build those warm limits based on, we know the species only goes down so far south. This is the climate that far south, so we figure this is the limit of where that species could be. But in reality, that it might not be in equilibrium, and some of these species may be able to handle a lot more warming than what we know about. And so we need to increase our understanding of how species respond to these various environmental factors. What time am I finished? On my head? Okay, I just want to go back to one figure here. That speaks to that point I'm trying to make. This figure here of the world and Ian Woodward's work. And so when you look at those bands of major vegetation types around the world, yeah, cold tolerance is really well known to drive the northern limit of what you see. Like if you look here where my mouse is pointing right now, it's actually, there's a specific isotherm, I forget if it's minus 40 or whatever it is, but there's a certain temperature threshold that you hit. And all of a sudden, a lot of species, especially specifically temperate deciduous species, they can't do their work once it gets colder than that. They don't got the biochemistry inside to handle that kind of freezing, and so they fall out. But the conifers and also a couple of deciduous species, spruce and aspen, they do have differences in the way their cells work to handle the cold freezing. So you see them they're able to populate further north, and hence that's what drives that band north. But what's less known is, though, this is what stops the deciduous trees from going north, the cold. But why? But we still have, though, conifers further south. So why aren't they more abundant farther south? Why don't they take over from the deciduous species? And so the southern limit of these major bands is what's less known, but it's hypothesized that competition really comes into play then. And so you could have white spruce perhaps growing in someone's garden in Virginia, but in a natural situation, it's really out of its element, and it's probably less competitive than the species that are native to that area that can grow and take advantage of that climate. So it's not competitive. So they think that competitive interactions are what limits us seeing more of those cold boreal species further south. And I think that's also an important point for silviculture. So again, it's like maybe we want to continue to grow red spruce in our forests 50 to 60 years down the road from here. So and maybe we can. Maybe they can grow under the warmer conditions. They might not compete as well. So if that's the case, then maybe thinning becomes more of a priority. Anyway, so like I was saying, we don't know as much about the warm limits of many of the species, which actually impedes our modeling work that we can do. But there are studies underway to help with this. So this is a nice study I want to highlight by a new professor at the University of Brunswick, local to Orangeville, and Nature last year. And it's a really comprehensive study that took over 270,000 tree cores from across Quebec in a pile of work, and then use those tree cores to look at changes in species growth. So they had 6 species, and they collected thousands of tree cores from each species across the entire area of Quebec. And that entire area of Quebec spans quite a latitudinal gradient, climatic gradient, a change in approximately 11 degrees in annual temperature. And also, this represents this big area, quite a wide gradient and moisture as well. And so where you have so many measurements of individual species tree growth across such a broad climatic range, then you could begin to try to narrow in on some of these specific climate growth relationships I'm talking about. And this is the graphic from this paper that really intrigued me. So this is showing growth rate for each of these 6 tree species for 2 climatic variables that were powerful, that were significant in his models. Maximum annual temperature, and then climate moisture index, which is a measure of moisture availability to the species. And I just wanted to focus in here specifically on white spruce. So when you look at all those tree rings across that big range of climate, what they found was that as temperature increases across that range, you see these are contour maps, or heat maps they're called, and the lighter the color, the higher the number, and the darker the color, the lower the number. And as you increase in temperature, you get an increase in growth, but then a decrease in growth as you get even warmer. So there's a real parabola or humpback shape there with the temperature of white spruce, and somewhat of a relationship with moisture. If we look at balsam fir down here, maybe that the hump with temperature is not quite as strong, but what is more powerful though is the change with balsam fir's growth potential with moisture. As you go down to the negative temperatures here on the moisture axis, which is drier, we see then a decrease in the growth of balsam fir. Anyway, so this represents an example of the type of empirical work needed to be done to better understand those specific climate growth relationships. And Loic used this work to make some projections of how climate may affect the future forests of Quebec, and specifically the growth of each one of those species. I'm only going to focus on just maybe white spruce because I think that's all we have time for. But if you look here at this figure here, this is for white spruce. If you focus on this specific graph here, this is what the growth rate of white spruce is projected to come if the climate in this area warms by 4 degrees and precipitation remains the same. And the more red it is, means there's a more, I think that's red, as a more of a decrease in growth. And that's what his results were showing, is that if he uses those relationships that he found, if he projects into the future, it's showing for the southern boreal in Quebec, a decrease in a decrease in the growth of white spruce, and the same with balsam fir as well. And of course, we're south of that area here in the Acadian forest. So, you know, I imagine that effect would be really extreme for us. So we have other studies that are currently underway to better help understand these climate performance relationships. And there's a couple I just wanted to highlight. The one is within my own lab in collaboration with UNB in the province of New Brunswick, and where we're looking at collecting, well, we have collected plot data, forest plot data from across eastern North America, from Quebec and Ontario, all through the Maritimes down to Florida. And each one of those plots, there's thousands and thousands of plots that cover that area, we have measures of DBH growth. And this big area also covers the range of many tree species from north to south, and also covers a wide gradient climate. So we're currently trying to disentangle within all that data, can we find a relationship between climate and species performance? Another study underway, which which involves LOIC, which we just submitted a proposal for funding, is to set up specific sites along the same sort of latitudinal gradient climate, eight potential sites right now, and at each one of these sites, we would actually establish a plantation where we would grow certain tree species, maybe certain families of tree species, to see how differences in climate, if you can control for everything else, may affect the performance of tree species. And we currently have an in-house experiment, and the guy actually doing the work is sitting up there in the lab straight, where we're doing something similar, but we're trying to do it in-house, and where we've built some small greenhouses. This is an example of one of them right here. And each one of these little greenhouses we're controlling for temperature and soil moisture and also carbon dioxide concentration to see how these various factors influence the early growth and survival of, well, this is red maple here, but a number of different tree species. So there's currently a lot of work underway to try to better quantify these relationships, which is critical to if we're going to try to make more accurate projections. So anyway, so what does all this mean for the local forestry sector? Well, in terms of some of the modeling work we've done thus far, if humanity could keep everything to RCP 2.6, maybe it would be minimal changes to the forestry sector here in the Maritimes. But if we keep going the way we're going right now under RCP 8.5, there's potential major changes coming in forest composition for the region and potential decreases in forest growth. So implications for wood supply. And where it's increasingly unlikely that we're going to be able to meet that RCP 2.6 scenario, we should begin to really consider preparing for more of the RCP 8.5. So what can we do about some of these things? Well, the biggest thing I think that we should be doing is trying to mitigate more, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Megan alluded to earlier pro-carbon forestry, using forest ecosystems to our advantage to help absorb and store more carbon. There's a really neat study actually in the news this past week about a group out of Australia who are now able, though, to sequester carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, turn it back into coal. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it sounds like a really promising technology. But those are all related to the mitigation side of things. But there's very likely we're going to see changes no matter what, and so we need to prepare and adapt. Such things in terms of adaptation actions, assisted migration, maybe proactively looking into moving species or genotypes of species that are currently here further north. Adaptive silviculture, the theme of this workshop, is another option, and also looking into alternative forest products for our region. And the other thing that we should be doing continually is monitoring programs, monitoring changes in our forests over time. More of these experiments and field studies that I alluded to just earlier, and then using this new information to improve our ability to forecast what the future forests will look like. So that's all I have. Thank you.